Ronke and Nnamdi had built what seems to be the perfect life together. Despite 5 years of childlessness, they had managed to stay deeply in love and supportive of each other. Ronke, a beautiful businesswoman, ran a flourishing fabrics, shoes, and bag shops in the city, while Nnamdi, an accountant, worked for a prestigious company. They were devoted Christians who trusted God and hoped that one day He would bless them with a child. From the moment they exchanged vows, they had prayed and hoped for children. Ronke had fasted and prayed, attending church services and seeking divine intervention. But every passing year was marked by disappointment. Though it was a burden on her heart, but Nnamdi's unwavering love gave her strength. He reassured her constantly that their marriage was built on love, not just the hope of children. Nnamdi, originally from the eastern part of the country, and Ronke from the west, were proof that love transcended ethnic lines. Despite cultural differences, they built a life of unity, dedicated to their faith and each other. Every Sunday, they worshipped together, praying for God's mercy, believing that someday they would be blessed with a child. But as the years went by, pressure from the outside world, especially from Nnamdi's mother, began to cast a dark shadow over their home. Nnamdi's mother, Nne Adaobi, a traditional woman from the village, had grown increasingly frustrated with the fact that her son had no children. In her eyes, it was Ronke's fault, and she made no effort to hide her disdain. One weekend, as Ronke and Nnamdi were relaxing in the living room, enjoying each other's company, a sudden knock on the door startled them. When Nnamdi opened the door, there stood his mother, her eyes filled with anger. Without a word of greeting, she marched into the house and began to hurl insults at Ronke. "You will leave my son's house today," Nne Adaobi shouted, her voice rising with every word. "You are a barren witch who have eaten up all your children." Ronke, taken aback, tried to maintain her composure. "Mama, I am not the one who gives children," she said softly, though her voice trembled. "It is God who gives kids, and He will give us at the appointed time." But Nne Adaobi was relentless. Her voice grew louder, and her words were hurtful. "No, you are the reason. You've brought nothing but shame to this family. You are cursed." Nnamdi, unable to bear the attack on his wife any longer, intervened. "Mama, that's enough. Why did you come here without telling me? And now you are insulting my wife in our own home?" His voice was firm but filled with hurt. "I won't take that from you or anyone. Please leave my house." Ronke, overwhelmed by the tension, ran to their bedroom in tears, leaving Nnamdi and his mother behind. Nnamdi quickly followed her, leaving Nne Adaobi fuming in the living room. In the privacy of their bedroom, Ronke collapsed onto the floor, crying uncontrollably. Nnamdi knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her. "I am so sorry, my love," he whispered, his own heart aching. "I promise I will never let anyone hurt you like this. I am not leaving you, ever." Despite Nnamdi's assurance, Nne Adaobi remained in their home, and the tension only worsened. Her insults towards Ronke grew more frequent, and Ronke felt trapped in her own home. One day, while cooking in the kitchen, Nne Adaobi entered and intentionally carried a pot of soup Ronke was cooking and poured it all over the floor. The hot liquid splashed onto Ronke, causing her to cry out in pain. Nnamdi, hearing the commotion, rushed into the kitchen and was horrified at the sight. His anger flared. "Mama, that's enough!" he shouted. "You have no right to treat her this way." He stormed into his mother's room, packed her bags, and ordered his driver to take her back to the village. That evening, Nnamdi took Ronke to the hospital to ensure she was okay. But even though her physical injuries healed, the emotional scars from her mother-in-law's constant torment remained. As the months passed, the weight of their childlessness continued to hang over them. Ronke's faith, once strong and unshakable, began to falter. The endless prayers, visits to the hospitals, and reassurance from the doctors that there was nothing wrong with her or Nnamdi no longer brought her comfort. She began to lose hope. Meanwhile, Ronke has a close friend named Tolu. They've been friends since childhood and even went to the same university. Back in school, Ronke was a well-behaved and responsible one, while Tolu had a more reckless attitude. Ronke's life always seemed perfect, and it showed in her excellent grade. She was a top student, while Tolu, who rarely took her studies seriously, often resorted to bribing her way to good grades. Despite their differences, they remained inseparable and did almost everything together. One afternoon, while at her shop, Tolu came to visit. Ronke, unable to hold back her emotions any longer, broke down in tears, telling Tolu everything she had been enduring. "Tolu, I don't know what else to do," Ronke sobbed. "I have fasted and prayed, but nothing is happening. I am losing hope." Tolu, concerned for her friend, offered a solution that Ronke had never considered. "There is a herbalist I know," Tolu said hesitantly. "She's helped a lot of women conceive. Maybe you should try it." Desperate for answers, Ronke agreed. A few days later, on a hot afternoon, Tolu and Ronke visited the herbalist. The elderly woman, with wrinkled skin and a mysterious air about her, performed several rituals before handing Ronke a small packet of black powder. "Put this in your husband's food," the herbalist instructed. "Once he eats it and lay with you, you will conceive." Ronke, desperate for a solution, clung to the herbalist's words. She left the herbalist home with a renewed sense of hope. But as she drove home, her car suddenly began to jerk, and she was forced to pull over to the side of the road. She got out of the car to check, wondering what was wrong, when a mad woman approached her, begging for money. Without thinking, Ronke pulled some money from her purse and handed it to the woman. As the woman took the money, she stared into Ronke's eyes and said, "Don't use the black substance. It is dangerous." Ronke froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The mad woman turned and walked away, leaving Ronke standing by her car. Fear creeping into her soul, she rushed back to her car, forgetting for a moment that it had been malfunctioning. Miraculously, the engine started and she drove home, her mind racing with thoughts of the strange encounter. When she arrived home, she sat in her car for a long time, staring at the packet of black powder. Doubt filled her mind, and the words of the mad woman echoed in her ears. Could it really be dangerous? She thought to herself. But what Ronke did not know was that her closest friend Tolu, who appeared sympathetic on the outside, harbored deep envy. Tolu couldn't stand Ronke's seemingly perfect life and marriage. As someone who has struggled with her own relationships and personal failures, she secretly wished to see Ronke fall. Tolu had been the one that orchestrated the dangerous game. She had connived with the old woman to deceive Ronke in putting the black substance in Nnamdi's food. Later that evening, Tolu secretly called Nnamdi, masking her voice and warning him not to eat any food his wife served him that night because it had been poisoned. Nnamdi was puzzled by the anonymous call but dismissed it as a prank. However, as he drove home that night, the warning echoed in his mind. When he arrived home, the inviting aroma of dinner filled the air, and Nnamdi decided to check Ronke in the kitchen. As he approached, he froze in shock as he witnessed Ronke pouring a strange black powder into his meal. His heart raced. He silently retreated to the bedroom, unable to believe what he had just seen. Could the anonymous caller have been right? Was his beloved wife trying to poison him? Moments later, Nnamdi came out of the living room, acting as if nothing had happened. When Ronke saw him, she was startled. "When did you get home?" she asked, surprised by his quiet entrance. "Oh, I just got in." "I am starving," he replied, masking his emotions. Ronke smiled and set the table, urging him to sit down and eat. But Nnamdi, his suspicions growing, insisted that she join him. Ronke refused, explaining that she was fasting. And that was the final confirmation for Nnamdi. His voice trembled as he asked, "What did you put in my food, Ronke?" Ronke froze, her heart sinking as her hands began to shake. She couldn't lie to him, and in that moment, the weight of her guilt bore down on her. "It's something the herbalist gave me. Tolu took me there. I only wanted to do what she said would help us have a child." Nnamdi's face darkened with anger. "And you thought poisoning me was the answer? Where is your faith, Ronke? What happened to trusting in God? Go inside, pack your things, and leave my house," Nnamdi said in rage. Ronke fell to her knees, weeping, begging for his forgiveness. But he was wounded by the betrayal, stormed off, packed her bags himself, and threw them outside. "I cannot stay with someone who will try to kill me," he said, his voice cold and final. Devastated, Ronke gathered her things and left for her parents' home in the village. She told them everything, and though they were heartbroken, they promised to speak to Nnamdi on her behalf. The next day, Ronke's parents went to Nnamdi's house, pleading with him to forgive their daughter. But Nnamdi, still hurt, remained unmoved. He sent them away, insisting that his decision was final. Weeks passed, and Ronke, living with her parents, continued to pray for reconciliation. Her heart ached for her husband, but she also felt ashamed of her actions. "Oh, how I wish I had listened to that mad woman the other day. Maybe I wouldn't be facing all this. Maybe my marriage wouldn't be in this mess," Ronke said, sobbing. But then she decided to go see her husband herself, hoping to beg him one more time. But when she arrived, she was met with a shocking sight. Nnamdi was in the living room kissing another woman. Ronke stood frozen, her heart shattering as she watched her husband, Nnamdi, kiss another woman in their living room. Barely able to control her emotions, she asked in a trembling voice, "Who is she?" pointing at the woman beside him. Nnamdi, cold and unfeeling, responded, "Her name is Hamaka, my new wife, the woman who would give me the child you couldn't, and she's not a murderer like you." The words cut through Ronke like a knife. She felt her world collapse, and without warning, she dropped to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. There was no compassion in Nnamdi's eyes as he roughly pulled her up and dragged her out of the house. "Don't ever come back here again," he warned, his voice filled with disdain. Humiliated and broken, Ronke stumbled away from the place that was once her home, the place where she had once been loved. Tears streamed down her face, and she knew in that moment that everything she had worked for, her marriage, her love, was gone. All she could do was cry, lost in the unbearable pain of losing her home and her beloved husband. Ronke tried desperately to reach her best friend Tolu, wanting to explain everything that had happened. But no matter how many times she called, Tolu's phone remained unreachable. Determined, she decided to visit Tolu's home, only to find out that Tolu had moved out a week earlier without a word. I need to go back to the old woman and tell her what's happening in my home, Ronke thought. But when she arrived at the herbalist hut, she found it abandoned, with no sign that anyone had lived there for a long time. The place was eerily empty. Ronke's frustration and fear grew even stronger. "What's happening?" she cried out. "Tolu is nowhere to be found, and now the old woman is gone. God, what have I gotten myself into?" Tears streamed down her face as she realized the depth of the situation she had trapped herself in. After several failed attempts to find Tolu or any answers from the herbalist, Ronke gave up the search. Heartbroken and overwhelmed with guilt, she turned back to God, praying for a miracle to restore her broken marriage. Months had passed since Ronke left her old life behind, trying to heal from the heartbreak. She focused on her business, running her shop as usual, and kept her faith strong, praying each day for a new beginning. Despite everything, she still missed Nnamdi and silently hoped for a miracle to restore her home, though she had accepted her reality. Few more weeks had passed and Ronke began to feel unwell. At first, she thought it was stress from managing her shop and dealing with the emotional weight of her separation from Nnamdi. But when the symptoms persisted, she decided to visit the hospital for a checkup. Sitting in the doctor's office, Ronke received news she never expected. She was 3 months pregnant. Her heart raced with mixed emotions: shock, joy, disbelief. She realized that she had already conceived before she even followed Tolu to the herbalist's place. If only she had known back then, maybe her home would still be intact, and she wouldn't have to let her desperation drive her to take such drastic measures. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought of Nnamdi. How she wished he was there to share in her joy. She had longed for this moment for so many years, but now the person she had wanted to celebrate it with was no longer by her side. She burst into tears, overwhelmed by the miracle she had thought would never come. After regaining her composure, Ronke thanked God for the blessings she thought she might never receive. She felt a deep sense of gratitude mixed with regret for the choices she had made. She wished she could turn back time, but in that moment, she was grateful for the new life growing inside her. Ronke shared the good news with her parents, who were overjoyed. Her mother hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face, while her father gave her a proud, comforting smile. They all thanked God for this miracle, their hearts filled with hope and excitement for the future. A few weeks after Ronke discovered her pregnancy, Nnamdi received some joyful news that Amaka had also conceived. Nnamdi was over the moon with excitement, feeling as though his prayers had finally been answered. He threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival, buying baby clothes and decorating the nursery with bright colors and toys. Nnamdi was determined to be the best father, and the thought of holding his child in his arms gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Despite the challenges and the pain he had faced, Nnamdi now saw this as a chance to rebuild his life. He waited with bated breath, counting the days until he would hear the first cry of his child, imagining the laughter and joy that would soon fill his home. His heart was full of hope as he and Amaka shared moments of happiness, thinking that perhaps this child would restore their lost hope. Nnamdi's mind often drifted back to Ronke, though he wondered where she was and if she had moved on. But with the new life he was building, he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the future and the family he believed was just around the corner. After a few more months, Ronke delivered a healthy baby boy, and her joy knew no bounds. Her parents were thrilled, and Ronke couldn't believe how much her life had changed. The miracle she thought would never come had finally happened. She cherished every moment with her son, grateful for the second chance life had given her. Meanwhile, Amaka also went into labor a few weeks after Ronke. Nnamdi was excited to welcome their baby girl into the world. He had eagerly waited for the day he would hold his daughter, and when she arrived, he was overcome with joy. His home felt full again, and he looked forward to being the father he had always dreamt of being. But only a few days after Amaka gave birth, their baby girl developed complications. Nnamdi and Amaka rushed to the hospital where the doctors told them their daughter needed a blood transfusion. Nnamdi immediately offered his blood, confident that he could save his daughter. But after a series of tests, the doctor returned with shocking news. Nnamdi's blood didn't match the baby's. Confusion and anger filled him. "But how is that possible?" he demanded. "The baby is mine," he said, turning towards the direction Amaka was standing. In that moment, Amaka broke down in tears and confessed that Nnamdi was not the father of the child. Her ex-lover was. Nnamdi stood frozen, his world shattered. The betrayal cut deep and the weight of the revelation was unbearable. He stormed out of the hospital, warning her never to step foot in his house again. The pain of betrayal consumed Nnamdi. He turned to alcohol, drinking to numb the sorrow that had gripped him. The bottle became his only solace, and soon his work began to suffer. His once promising career crumbled, and before long he was fired from the company he had served faithfully for years. Isolated and broken, Nnamdi spiraled deeper into depression, losing sight of who he once was. Meanwhile, Ronke continued to flourish in her business after the birth of her son. She built a life for herself and her child, regaining her confidence and finding joy in motherhood. She remained active in her church, and one evening after a service, her pastor called her to his office. He told her that God had revealed it was time for her to return to her husband, as the Lord had restored her marriage and that the truth would soon come to light. Ronke was filled with mixed emotions, joy because she longed to reunite with her first love, but sadness as she remembered the day Nnamdi had thrown her out without giving her a second chance. Nevertheless, she trusted the message and agreed to return home. On the day she went back, her pastor accompanied her. When Nnamdi saw them standing at his doorstep, he fell to his knees, overwhelmed with guilt and regret. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched Ronke's hand, begging for her forgiveness. "I was wrong. I should have trusted you and believed in our love," Nnamdi cried. The pastor also pleaded with Ronke to let go of the past and embrace their future together. He reminded them both that God had restored their marriage and that they needed to rebuild their faith. Ronke, with tears in her eyes, told Nnamdi how she had discovered she was pregnant only a few months after he had sent her away and how she had given birth to a beautiful boy. Peter's heart swelled with joy and disbelief as he saw his son for the first time. He confessed everything to Ronke about Amaka, their lost child, and how his life had fallen apart since she left. Ronke, still hurt but seeing his sincerity, allowed herself to forgive him. They wept together, and in that moment, they decided to rebuild their life and marriage. With a renewed sense of faith in God, they prayed together, acknowledging the trials they had endured, but also the lessons they had learned. Nnamdi soon found a new job, better than the last, and their family life blossomed again. They had been tested, but they emerged stronger, knowing that love and faith could overcome even the darkest times. One day, as the family were returning from a supermarket where they had been shopping, they unexpectedly spotted Tolu, Ronke's former best friend, begging for alms on the side of the road. Dressed in rags, her face pale and gaunt, Tolu looked like a shadow of her former self. She was unrecognizable, lost in her misery and seemingly forgotten by the world. As they drove by, Ronke caught sight of her. "Tolu!" she shouted, unable to contain her shock. Nnamdi stopped the car as Ronke stepped out, her heart pounding in disbelief. Tolu, startled by the familiar voice, looked towards them but couldn't bear to meet Ronke's eyes. She quickly fell to her knees, her face filled with shame and regret. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she began to confess. "I am so sorry, Ronke. Please forgive me," Tolu begged, her voice trembling. "It was me. I orchestrated everything. I took you to the herbalist and lied to Nnamdi. I was jealous of your perfect life, your loving husband, and everything you had. I wanted to destroy it all. I was bitter because every time you spoke about your marriage, I felt like you were mocking me for not being lucky with men. Ronke stood frozen, her mind reeling as she tried to process the depth of the betrayal. The one person she had called her best friend, her confidant, had been the mastermind behind her darkest days. The pain of the revelation hit her like a wave, and tears welled up in her eyes. She never imagined Tolu, the woman she had trusted like a sister, could harbor so much resentment and envy. Tolu's voice cracked as she continued. I have lost everything because of my actions. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I am begging you, please forgive me. Ronke sobbed, overwhelmed with emotions. Nnamdi stepped forward and gently placed his hand on her shoulder, a silent reminder that they had moved past the pain and also rebuilt their life and family despite it all. After a moment of silence, Ronke wiped her tears, looking down at Tolu, who was still kneeling. Her heart ached, not only for the betrayal, but also for the broken woman in front of her, reduced to such a state because of her own bitterness and envy. Without another word, Ronke turned and got back into the car. Nnamdi started the engine and they drove away, leaving Tolu in her misery and misfortune. Ronke couldn't bring herself to say anything. She had lost the friend she thought she had, but at that moment, she realized that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and some wounds, no matter how deep, didn't always need to be revisited. As they drove off, Ronke took Nnamdi's hand and squeezed it tightly. She was grateful for the life they had, the love they shared, and the peace that had come after the storm. They had endured trials and pain, but together they had emerged stronger than ever. Tolu's downfall was a painful reminder of how envy and bitterness could ruin lives, but for Ronke, it was also a powerful lesson. She had chosen the path of forgiveness and faith, and now she had everything she had once dreamed of: her family, her peace, and her happiness. In the end, their journey was a reminder that love endures all trials and that true faith doesn't waver in the face of hardship. The end.